Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Amor Towles is the author of the New York Times bestsellers Rules of Civility, A Gentleman in Moscow, and The Lincoln Highway. The three novels have collectively sold more than 5 million copies and have been translated into more than 35 languages. Towles now shares some of his shorter fiction, 6 stories based in New York City, and a novella set in Golden Age Hollywood. The new book is Table for Two Fictions. Also, Towles served as the guest editor for the Best Short Stories 2024, the O. Henry Prize Winners Collection. This year's edition contains 20 stories chosen from the thousands published in magazines over the previous year. Towles has brought his own perspective to the prize, selecting stories by an engaging mix of celebrated names and emerging voices. To discuss short fiction, being an editor, and about his own work and career, it is a great pleasure, an honor, to welcome Amor Towles to this week's book show. Amor, thank you very much for being with us. What a delight to have you on the program.
It's a pleasure to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
I have to say first that I read Table for Two earlier in the year and was blown away by it. And because these are such amazing stories that are so, I'm going to use a word that I don't know how you're going to react to it, but they're perfect. They're just they're just perfect. I assume you've been writing short stories for a long time, and how you became engaged in the form.
And your instinct is right. I began writing fiction as a boy, but the short story was the primary format in which I worked while I was in college, while I was in graduate school, and that's not uncommon, I don't think, for novelists in general. The short story really is the optimal format in which to try to master elements of craft. Even if your long-term intention is to write novels or screenplays or whatever, the short story provides, because of its brevity, an opportunity for a young writer to take on different voices, to try different tempos of writing. I don't mean the actual process. I mean the tempo of what the language sounds like. Different approaches to imagery, different approaches to character development, different approaches to dialogue. You know, in each story that you attack or go or try to create, you can take all the elements of craft and approach them differently. And where in a novel, that would be a challenge as a young writer to try to experiment in novels. You'd spend several years writing a work of several hundred pages, and you basically get to do one experiment, so you don't really learn from that in the same way that you can by moving through all these different stories in different fashion that allow you to experiment with and ideally master the various elements of craft. So yes, short stories have been long been a part of my process, or been a part of they're a pleasure to write. It's a very different art form than the novel, of course, but has its own sort of merits and attractions, I think.
At the very beginning of the O. Henry collection for this year, you say, for a variety of reasons, surprise is less significant in our experience of the novel. Often when we begin to read a novel, we already know something of what it contains. And you go on to say that when we pick up a short story, we have really no idea.
Yeah. I do think that that's, true. Of course, there's exceptions to any rule, but I do think it's generally true. And an aspect of that, an important one, is that the novel, consciously or unconsciously, a novelist in writing, let's say, the first 50 pages of a novel, has to be very focused on orientation, helping the reader understand when this is taking place, where it's taking place, who the key characters are, what has recently happened to them, and that has sort of created the emotional stakes. Where is this going, through foreshadowing? Again, consciously or unconsciously, novelists do this. And it's important that they do it, because the way that we read novels and gain from novels is generally by tracking evolution, how a character is changing, how a moral attitude is evolving, how interrelationships are evolving among the characters. And to sort of track change in that way, you have to start with a pretty firm grounding. this is where we are, this is who they are, this is what's happening, when it's happening. And from there, we can start to track the changes that both delight and inform us as readers. And none of this is central to the short story, because in the short story, we don't have the time as readers or writers to lay all this foundational groundwork. And what I really come to sort of think about it more recently is the short story. It's the closest analogy for me is it's like you go to a restaurant and you sit down, and at the table right next to you is a man and woman, and they are in a heated conversation, and they're so wrapped up in the conversation, they're not even lowering their voice. So you can't help but hear everything that's happening between them. And you start to ask yourself questions. Wait, is she married to him? What did he do last night? Is that his wife? Who's Joe? Or whatever as you're listening, and it just, as you're beginning to piece together what has happened between these two people sitting next to you, they pay their check and they leave. And you're like, wait a second, I'm not done yet. I have unfinished questions that you haven't been answered yet. And this is what the short story is like in a way. It starts with, you're right in it. You have to sort of figure out as the reader, who are these people? What is their relationship to each other? When is this taking place, and where is it taking place? What has happened that has put them in this various moods? And just as you're sort of beginning to piece it all together and gain an understanding of everything, it's over. Before the writer has taken the liberty of spelling it all out. And I think this is I love this about the short story, right? It's a liberty for the writer in a way to sort of capture this glimpse of life. I think it can be very liberating for the reader to go through that same sort of experience, which is so different from the experience of the investment of reading a novel and the sort of a longer, slower payout of events.
So take me to the experience of the writer, of the difference for you in even looking at the Table for Two collection as an example of the difference from a story early in the book that are shorter to even Hollywood, which is longer, considered a novella. Are they basically the same for you, the same process and form, and one that maybe just got away from you a little bit?
Yeah, it's a good way of thinking about it, because you're right. In Table for Two, there's sort of 6 short stories set in New York, most of them around the year 2000. And let's say they're on average about, 30, 35 pages long each, or 40 pages long, something like that. Right. And suddenly here's Even Hollywood, and, it's a 200-page, narrative. What is it doing there? And what is it, how does it differ, and how did it happen? First of all, I had started by writing Rules of Civility. 13 years ago, it came out. Eve is a character in Rules of Civility. In the course of that novel in 1938, she leaves New York City and kind of disappears into Hollywood. And, her friend, who's the narrator of Rules of Civility, Katie, just gets a glimpse of her new life in California, finding out that she's befriended Olivia de Havilland somehow. And that's kind of all we know. That's all I knew. And in the aftermath of writing that novel, I was just sort of fascinated by what Eve was doing in Hollywood, and because I loved her as a character. And so back then, I wrote about a 50-page glimpse into her new life in California. And it was sort of through 5 interactions that she has. So you kind of meet these 5 people who meet her. She makes an impression on the 5 of them as events unfold. And that was the whole thing. And when I was putting together Table for Two, the collection, that's what I submitted initially into the collection, was this 60-page glimpse of these 5 interactions. And almost the minute I submitted it, I was like, it's not enough. Because I knew in my head where those interactions went. I knew what would happen to Eve and what she would do next, and how the bigger impact would have on these 5 strangers that she meets in California. And so as soon as I handed the manuscript, I said, send it back. And and this is true, I flew out to the Beverly Hills Hotel where Eve stays. I checked in and I began doing the story justice. And suddenly it was a 200-page thing. And as you say, kind of got away from me in that sense, right? I
right.
I just followed the thread. Now,
to the point of a part 1 and a part 2.
Yes, that's right. For those who pick it up now, the part 1 is in largely that 50 or 60-page glimpse that I wrote years ago. And the part 2 is what happens next, and where you really see the bigger impact that Eve is having on the others, and the bigger evolution in herself as an individual. why didn't I just do it as a novel? Because that's kind of embedded in your question. Why is that in this collection? And,
Yeah.
to some degree, the answer is that the nature of that piece is that it's different than A Gentleman in Moscow and the Lincoln Highway and the Rules of Civility. It is not as multi-layered. It is not as intricate. It is told in sort of a greater pace and sort of a greater, sort of tighter through line in a noirish style. And so for me, it didn't have the sort of the complete architecture of a novel in terms of my own feelings towards it. It felt more like an extended short story than it did, a shorter novel. So that's
Well,
why it ended up there.
well, that's what I was curious about. So the process then generally very similar to your process of writing a short story.
Yeah, well, and I'm a planner always. So all my work, short or long, is thoroughly planned in advance of writing. So it's just that when I'm writing a novel, I'll plan the novel for 3 years, let's say, before I start outlining and then writing it. By the time I outline it and sit down to write chapter one, I know 90% of the book in my head, and the people, the places, the events, the interactions, the tone, I know all that. And same thing with the short stories. It's just instead of a 3-year planning period, it's more like a 3-month planning period. And instead of a 40-page outline, it's a 2-page outline. But so in each of those stories, I do kind of know what's happening. And as I say, what happened in the case of Eve is that in my head, I had been planning kind of already the aftermath. I just hadn't bothered to sit down and write it. But so the collection itself was an impulse to get it done.
Amor Towles is our guest. The new book of his fictions is Table for Two. He is also the editor of the new collection, The Best Short Stories 2024, the O. Henry Prize winners. When you're writing in these stories, especially in the first 6 stories, as the narrator, it's almost as if you're our tour guide, right? I mean, you are talking directly to us, and there's an offhanded, familiar relationship that you, in most of the stories, that you establish fairly early.
You're absolutely right about that. In the framework of a short story, that can be advantageous because you're luring the reader into the world you're creating, and the sooner you can do that, the better. You don't want to build barriers between the narrative and the reader in a short story. You got to get them in as quickly as possible. You raise an interesting observation, Joe, and I would say that as someone who is a planner, when I have an idea for a novel or a story, I tend to know very quickly when it takes place, where it takes place, who the main characters are, even what are the main events. I tend to know that very, very quickly. I mean, like in minutes. One of the last choices, in essence, to make, which is one of the most challenging choices, one of the most interesting choices, is who is going to narrate the story. Because you can take the same event with the same characters and you can tell it in 50 different ways. And when you shift who is telling the story, is it the omniscient narrator? Is it one of the main characters doing it in the first person? Is it a third person, but from the perspective of, a sibling or a spouse who's watching somebody else? Each one of these changes would radically change the tone of the story and to some degree its themes. Because when you change the orientation, what matters in the story is going to change. I find that to be one of the most intriguing and difficult and, as I say, fascinating decisions that I'm going to have to make. One of the things that happens in the Table for Two, the first two stories are just as you described. It's an omniscient narrator, but one who's got a little bit of personality,
Yep.
is willing to address the reader quite directly, is very confident in what they have to say, but they are omniscient in the sense that they know everything that's happened to their characters. They know what's going on inside their head. They know what's going to happen in the future. They know what happened in the past. Pure omniscience in that sense. And that's in the first two stories. Call it up here. For those listeners, I'm putting my hands up my head to indicate
Thank you.
the
Very
height
good.
of what they're doing. Well, the next story, which is called Hasta Luego, is about a guy in an airport during a snowstorm who meets by chance the man standing in line in front of him while they're trying to reschedule their flights, and they end up going to the same hotel while they wait for the weather to clear. So what you have is you move from omniscience to somebody who does not know the central character, is observing the central character, but it's one human being observing another, and all they know is what they see, and that kind of thing. Well, you can move from there to the next stories, and it's I Will Survive and The Bootlegger. And these are cases where the narrator is one step removed from the main character. In one case, It is the husband is describing his wife's interactions with her mother and her stepfather. And in the next story, it is a wife talking about her husband's interactions with a stranger at Carnegie Hall. And so the narrator from omniscience in the first two stories, holding my hands over my head, is coming down, and you're moving the narrator closer to events. But now it's your proximity, because it's a spouse, someone who knows a great deal about the main character, but they are not
Mm.
the character. They have opinions about the main character and what they do. The next story, the sixth of the story, is one where it is the character describing to them what happened to them. It's pure first person or genuine first person. So over the course of reading the six stories, you're moving from omniscience closer and closer and closer to the protagonist. And you get to sort of feel as you're reading how that changes your experience with the story, your perspective on events, the way that you think about the material thematically. When you get to even Hollywood, what we haven't described is that that is actually told from 8 different perspectives. And each of the perspectives is deeply inside the consciousness of the 8 different characters, where you are hearing what they hear, seeing what they see, thinking what they think, viewing the world as they view the world. And so you make this journey over the course of the collection from pure omniscience all the way down to intricate internal psychological first person reading.
You described the bootlegger, and I love that story. And it's about a man who has decided to get a subscription series at Carnegie Hall, and then finds out, notices that the gentleman sitting next to him in a raincoat is illegally taping the performance. So to have his wife tell that story is just great. Oh my goodness, it's just lovely because she as you say, she obviously has her rolling her eye moments. She's there, she's witnessing most of this, and in fact, it witnesses more than even the gentleman does. That just felt so real to me.
Yeah, thank you.
Did anything close to that ever happen to you?
Well, I would say that the those who know my work, obviously Gentleman in Moscow starts in Russia in 1922, and Rules of Civility is about a young working class woman in New York in 1938, and Lincoln Highway is about 18-year-old boys starting in the Midwest in the 1950s. So I have not written about my personal experiences to date in these works. The first 5 pages or 4 pages of The Bootlegger is probably the most autobiographical thing I have ever written in my life. So yes, it is exactly what happened to me and my wife. We did subscribe to a series at Carnegie Hall in order to see the famous pianist Eugenie Kissin. Just like in the story, to do that, we had to buy tickets to multiple nights in order to secure the performance we wanted to go to. When you are in a series like that, you sit next to the same people every time you go because they own the same series. And yes, there was an old man in a raincoat sitting next to me the first night, and he was recording the concert, and it just bugged me. I couldn't believe it. And so he kept showing, every time we went back, here he was. And by the time that Eugenie Kissin played, I was so wrapped up in this guy recording the concert, my indignation, I was very had great moral indignation. I started imagining, I'm going to go get security. That's what I'm going to do. At the intermission, I'm going to get security, and I'm going to turn this guy in. The police are going to come. I'm imagining this great sort of victory for the rights of musical artists in my head. And of course, I didn't do that. But the end result was that the whole thing was to go see this pianist, Eugenie Kissin, who had never performed in America at the time. And the next morning, the New York Times reported that the standing ovation that he received was one of the longest in recent memory at Carnegie Hall. And I don't remember him playing, right? Because I spent the whole concert, obsessed with this guy and imagining this, this art thing I'm about to do. So, this happened almost 30 years ago. And, that's not uncommon with me. You sort of pack that away and like, oh yeah, that was a hell of a night. And then I was sort of writing shorts. All the book works in Table for Two are written in the last decade. And, maybe 7 years ago, I was like, that'd be kind of interesting to revisit that night and to imagine a story that describes that night, but where the guy actually does turn the old man in. And, let's see what happens when he does that. And then, as you say, you get into this thing, well, who should tell it? Should the old man tell it? Should it be an omniscient narrator? Should the young man who's turning him in tell it? And eventually you try it almost like a Rubik's Cube. You just keep twisting through variations to see what it sounds like and how the events would change. And eventually you try it from the wife's perspective and you're like, oh yeah, that's perfect. She's the one who should tell this story.
Amor Towles is our guest on this week's book show. We're speaking about his short stories and his fiction, but also he is the editor of the Best Short Stories 2024, the O. Henry Prize winners. So for the past 20 minutes or so, we've been talking about the form and talking about short stories. So what is it like for you then to cull through a pile and to edit these 20 some stories from other writers and different perspectives through your lens as a short story writer of what kind of rises to the top?
Well, I got to say, it was an honor to be asked to judge the O. Henry Prize, first of all. And it's one of the longest standing literary awards in American history. And if you look back at who won it in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, it's an incredible subset of American literary genius who have won it at different times. So it's a great honor to be asked to do it. But it was beyond that a very satisfying experience for me. Well, the way it works is there's a team who oversees the prize and over the years, and they read 1,000 stories published over the course of a year in all kinds of different literary journals, well-known and lesser well-known. It could be the university press, but it could be the New Yorker. And they read out, 1,000. They give me 100. And then I read the 100 and choose 20. And that's the kind of the filtering process. What you fear as someone who's put in this position is that you're going to have a pile of yes, a pile of maybe, a pile of no. And what you fear is that you end up with 10 in the yes pile, and 60 in the maybe pile. You got to choose 20, and you're going through the maybes trying to figure out, okay, well, maybe this one, And what happened here is it really was, I had more than 20 stories in the yes pile, where you have the luxury of knowing you're not going to be able to choose all the ones in the yes pile, but you do know that the 20 you're going to end up with are all expressions of literary excellence. And then also you have enough of a variety that you can put them together in a way that will be a satisfying reading experience as you move through the stories, hearing different voices, seeing different approaches to storytelling, dealing with different themes, but all with people who, are wonderfully masters of the sentence, creative in terms of their imagery, deft at depicting human experience and psychology. All of them share those components. And so, I think that readers are really going to enjoy moving through that much as I did.
Can you read a story, say by Dave Eggers or Kate DiCamillo, and without knowing who you're reading it from, in the sense of having that factor into what you're reading of their body of work, what they have achieved, which obviously is also very different from someone who this is perhaps their first or second story that's ever been published?
I did my best to ignore who wrote it, right, and also where it appeared. I really tried to focus. I would go right to title of the thing and start reading. And most of the people, probably 17 out of the 20 winners, I had not heard of their work, and that's terrific. And others may have heard of their work, right? That may be my limitation. Now, there were many people that I turned down where I love their work. I admire them as writers generally. But for whatever reason, that particular story, did not hold up against the creativity of this group, and of course that's all my personal thing, right? There's no absolute truth about that. So you do, I think you're, to your point, you're trying to make sure when you're given a task like this that you are putting the stories first, and then you kind of cross your fingers a little bit to say, well, I hope at the end, and I do remember this process where once you assemble the 20, is then I looked at more closely their names, where they were came out. And what you fear is that it's 90% women or 90% men, or that it's all people out of writing programs in the Northeast, or it's all stuff from the New Yorker. That's what you fear, right? And I'm glad to say that by focusing on the stories and kind of ignoring everything else, we ended up with a very attractively diverse roster in terms of where the stuff was published. There's a number of stories that are in translation by writers from outside the United States. There's a number of stories in English from writers outside the United States, from England and Scotland. And there's, the male and female,
Right.
all different ethnicities. But it really wasn't like I had a plan of achieving a diversity of voices. It really was just you put together the best stories. And so maybe that's really to the credit of the American short story publishing infrastructure, I guess, which is that it does capture, if you're willing to go down into, the university presses and some of the regional magazines, as the O. Henry team is willing to do, you really do capture a snapshot of American experience. Part of my job is to put them in order as well. That is up to me. I am allowed to decide the order of it if I want to. Well, partly from my experience of reading these stories. One of the things that the way they're laid out is that the first story deals with two young girls. And as you read through the next, 9 stories, whatever, you're moving chronologically through life. You're dealing with, young children and then teenagers and then sort of young adults and then a young married couple and then, a couple in, late marriage and, ultimately elderly people. And so the first 10 stories, you kind of go through this, evolution with them of sort of different moments of life. And then the 11th story takes you back to kids and you do it again. So it just so happened that I could lay out the stories in a way that setting aside ethnic diversity and geographic diversity around economics, socioeconomics, is that there's the diversity of human experience, right? Which is from youth to old age, and each of those phases of life, we naturally are grappling with different things.
Amor Towles is the editor of the Best Short Stories 2024, the O. Henry Prize winners. The book is published by Vintage. His story collection, Table for Two Fictions, is published by Viking. What a great delight and treat to speak with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Joe, it's great to be on the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.